A port that had known centuries of trade entered the autumn of 1939, believing it might once again sit at the edges of a European conflict. Alexandria watched from a distance as armies mobilized far away, its shoreline unchanged, its fishermen hauling nets as they always had. But on 3 September, when Egypt declared martial law and British headquarters shifted their weight toward the Mediterranean, the city began to sense that the sea outside its breakwaters was no longer simply a route for commerce. It was becoming a battlefield measured not in miles of front line, but in tonnage, berths, and the endurance of the people who worked along the quays. Warships arrived first, grey shapes gathering in the western harbour, their hulls taking space once used for merchant steamers. The Mediterranean fleet, commanded by Admiral Andrew Cunningham, needed shelter close to the central sea routes, and Alexandria's deep-water berths were suddenly essential. Dock workers who had spent their careers handling cotton bales and citrus crates now found themselves moving between destroyers, refueling at speed, their movements restricted by naval patrols and new identification checks. Each shift began with searches, roll calls, and hurried instructions delivered by foremen, who themselves were learning the new military routines only hours ahead of their crews. The city behind the port felt the strain almost immediately. Blackout curtains were issued quickly as rumors spread about Italian reconnaissance flights. Streets emptied early, shopkeepers shut windows, and families gathered around radios hoping for clarity that rarely came. The harbour's cranes continued to move, but now under the dim glow of shielded lamps, their arcs slower and more careful. Ships approached at night without their navigation lights, guided by quiet horns and small signal torches held close to decks. Dockers worked in near darkness, stumbling across uneven planks, using memory more than sight to judge the swing of a load. Labour patterns changed as fast as the skyline. Egyptian gangs, long organised through informal hiring and seasonal rhythms, were reshaped into task groups focused on military priorities. Maltese crews, many already skilled in naval dock work, were assigned to the front of high-skill tasks, while Egyptian workers took on heavier manual labour at lower wages. The unfairness was not new, but the war increased it. With merchant shipping pushed aside by troop transports and supply vessels, the amount of work grew even as the space to do it shrank. Tempers rose between foremen and crews, yet most shifts ended with the same tired understanding. The port had no extra labour to depend on. Congestion rose week after week. Each incoming convoy added another layer of pressure. Cargo that once moved smoothly across the quays now sat in piles, waiting for inspection by military authorities. Winch operators were in such short supply that some captains delayed departure just to wait for one or two exhausted men finishing a previous shift. The rail spur linking the waterfront to the main Cairo line often backed up, leaving crates in exposed positions long past the safe limits. Workers complained that even the simplest task, moving a pallet from ship to shed, needed 3 signatures, 2 delays, and 1 reluctant approval. Despite the pressure, the port became a crossroads of cultures, a place where the war reshaped human geography faster than any map. British naval ratings mingled with Egyptian labourers during short breaks, exchanging cigarettes and bits of conversation. Greek merchants, displaced by the early disorder in Europe, set up temporary offices along the Corniche. Sudanese workers, recruited for their strength and reliability, joined stevedoring gangs on the coal quays. The mixture brought moments of friendship, but also friction, as rationing tightened and working hours grew longer. Alexandria had always been a cosmopolitan city. Now its diversity was created by necessity rather than choice. By early 1940, the weight of expectation pressed harder. Each rumour from Europe seemed to echo across the harbour. Italy was mobilizing. The Mediterranean might soon be contested. The fleet might face attacks. Dockers found themselves caught between military urgency and civilian worry. Blackout drills interrupted loading schedules. Public warnings urged citizens to prepare for air raids, though few had ever experienced one. Women and children moved inland to stay with relatives, leaving neighborhoods near the waterfront quieter, their courtyards filled with an unease as thick as the coal dust drifting from the quays. When the Italian declaration of war arrived on 10 June, the announcement felt less like a shock than a confirmation of fears already absorbed. The port shifted instantly to strict naval control. Guards doubled their patrols. Workers' passes were checked again and again. Orders for ships came from naval headquarters rather than civilian port officials. And only days later, the first air raids signaled that Alexandria was no longer a safe harbor on the edge of the conflict. It was now part of it. Bombs did not need to hit a battleship to change the city's fate. Damaging a crane, a rail spur, or an oil tank could slow an entire campaign. Yet the work continued. As sirens wailed, crews took shelter behind warehouse walls. When the all clear sounded, they returned to their posts, lifting, hauling, and counting loads as if the Mediterranean's balance depended entirely on the minutes they could recover. Some nights ended with the quays soaked in seawater from quickly extinguished fires. Others ended with exhausted men walking home along darkened streets, unsure what the next day would bring. Alexandria had entered the war imagining distance. Instead, it found itself pulled into the center of a struggle defined by logistics, timing, and resilience. The port could no longer sleep, not when every shift, every crane, every pair of hands shaped the outcome of battles fought far beyond the horizon. And as the raids grew more frequent, the workers began to realize that the dangers gathering offshore would soon land directly among them, reshaping their routines and testing the limits of a harbor built for trade, not survival. The enemy's first blows did not fall upon the battleships anchored behind anti-torpedo nets. They came instead on the cranes, sheds, and rail tracks where Alexandria's dockworkers earned their living. When the summer of 1940 shifted into the first months of full war in the Mediterranean, the port learned that survival would depend as much on the stability of its waterfront equipment as on the armor of the fleet. Night after night, ships approached the harbor with every porthole darkened, guided only by faint lanterns and quiet signals. Dockers waited with tools ready, guessing at shapes in the dark as freighters moved slowly toward the quays, their captains terrified of drawing attention. Handling cargo under blackout conditions became a ritual of caution. Each swing of a derrick was careful. Each shouted instruction, softened by the fear that any noise might attract the next raid. The first Italian attacks tested the port's readiness, but the escalation came in June 1941, when Luftwaffe formations reached Alexandria with greater accuracy and greater intent. Workers spoke of hearing the bombers before seeing them, the sound rolling across the eastern harbor like a warning carried on the wind. That month's raids tore through vital machinery. Cranes bent under the force of blasts, rail tracks were twisted like wire, and several workshops were left in ruins. Oil tanks ignited in huge plumes that lit the night sky despite the blackout, a glow visible even from inland districts that had known war only as rumor until then. Archival figures differ on the number of casualties among the mixed labor gangs, but reports at the time noted that shifts were reorganized not just around output, but around which teams had suffered losses the night before. Yet the port had no chance to pause. When a freighter was damaged, Egyptian and Maltese salvage crews rushed to pull it clear of its berth before fire could reach neighboring ships. These teams, often working chest-deep in water or balancing on shaky planks, became the quiet stabilizers of the harbor, preventing single incidents from growing into disasters. Their work was careful rather than heroic. Ropes tightened, pumps placed, fires put out before they could burn through wooden decks. Each saved hull meant one less gap in the convoy cycle, one more vessel that could be repaired and returned to service rather than abandoned in the chaos of the waterfront. The repair yards felt the strain even more intensely. Alexandria's floating docks and slipways, already busy with routine maintenance, now cycled vessels through at a relentless pace. Destroyers arrived with torpedo scars cut into their sides. Cruisers carried shrapnel damage from fights off Crete and the Libyan coast. Engineers, Greek, Maltese, Egyptian, worked side by side, welding plates, strengthening beams, and finding creative solutions to shortages of imported parts. Some nights, the dry docks glowed from constant bursts of welding, a small constellation of sparks lighting the waterlogged pits below. Work rarely stopped, even when air raid sirens sounded. There were moments when crews huddled beneath steel frames for cover, returning only to finish tasks left mid-strike. Morale wavered under the rising danger. Egyptian dockers, already earning less than their European counterparts, demanded hazard pay for shifts that now carried the risk of sudden bombardment. British authorities proposed small bonuses, but negotiations stalled, and tensions simmered between the need to keep cargo moving and the workers' insistence that their lives had worth beyond tonnage. Some shifts ended early when rumours of coming raids spread. Others lasted deep into the night because a convoy could not afford delay. The exhaustion carved into workers' faces was matched only by the knowledge that failure here could affect soldiers in the desert, relying on every crate, drum, and shell. As months passed, the pattern of air alerts became as familiar as the tide. Workers learned to judge the distance of explosions by their echoes, to tell the difference between the dull thud of bombs hitting sand and the sharper crack of a direct hit on port structures. Some carried charms in their pockets, others spoke quietly of fate, and through it all, ships continued to arrive. Troop transports filled with reinforcements, freighters loaded with ammunition and fuel, hospital ships marked with red crosses that glowed faintly under moonlight. Despite the destruction, the port endured. Alexandria's waterfront became a place where danger was normal, where the line between civilian and military life blurred into a continuous effort to keep the war's machinery running. Every rebuilt crane, every cleared berth, every repaired hull showed a labour force that refused to collapse under pressure. But the raids were only part of the coming test. As the desert war intensified, the demands placed on the harbour would grow faster than the workers could match, pushing the city into a new phase of strain, one defined not only by destruction from above, but by the relentless hunger of a campaign consuming supplies at an unprecedented pace. And by the time those pressures arrived fully, Alexandria's workers would realize that the war was no longer striking the port from the sky, it was beginning to swallow it from within. Every mile fought in the western desert began its life in Alexandria. A crate lifted from a dimly lit quay could become a ration box in a distant camp. A drum rolled across a warehouse floor could power a line of trucks heading to the front. As the war expanded in 1940 and 1941, the port's workers felt that connection more clearly than any strategist looking at maps inland. The desert was not an idea to them, it was a hunger, and Alexandria was its kitchen. Operation Compass, launched at the end of 1940, brought the first surge. Ammunition arrived packed in wooden cases so tightly sealed that dockers used chisels and improvised levers just to separate them. Fuel drums, stacked like metal forests on deck, had to be rolled with precision across planks slick with dust and seawater. Trucks were lowered ashore in endless lines, their tires thudding against the pier with hollow knocks that echoed through the morning haze. The pace strained every muscle and every hour. What once took a full day was now done in half, and what once ended at sunset continued deep into the night. The harbour no longer slept, it pulsed. Shifts stretched into 14, sometimes 18 hours. Makeshift shelters, canvas sheets tied to rusted pipes, planks hammered into shade, gave workers brief rest during sweltering afternoons. Some collapsed there between tasks, boots still laced, shirts stuck to their skin with sweat and coal dust. Supervisors reported accidents rising, not from carelessness, but from exhaustion so deep that men forgot the last instruction they had given or received. Productivity changed with the heat, the wind, the availability of water, and the sudden bursts of convoy traffic. By mid-1941, the workforce itself had become a mosaic shaped by war. Greek refugee mechanics, arriving after their homeland fell to the Axis, found work in repair yards and engine shops. Yugoslav seamen stranded by the fall of their navy took temporary roles in cargo movement. Sudanese labourers, long employed in heavy stevedoring, were assigned to the busiest coal and fuel quays, and at the heart of it were the Egyptian dockers, forming the majority of the labor force, their hands carrying the weight of the desert's needs. The mixture introduced new rhythms and new tensions. Languages mixed in half-understood commands. Work habits clashed and blended. Yet when convoys arrived in clusters 6, sometimes 8 ships at once, the differences disappeared. Crews sorted cargo not by origin but by urgency. Ammunition first, fuel second, food and medical supplies wherever space allowed. Naval officers walked the quays, pushing for speed but mindful that a single mistake with a fuel line or sling load of shells could cost the port more than time. It became common for workers to keep going despite aching limbs or cut hands until the final crate was lowered, because stopping meant risking a backlog that could choke the entire harbour. The pressure was not only physical. Wage disputes simmered beneath the surface. Egyptian workers, earning less than Maltese or European staff, filed petitions through the Alexandria Dock Workers Syndicate, demanding adjustments to the rising cost of living and the growing dangers of their work. British officials recognized the unfairness but moved slowly, wary that raising wages for one group would force the whole Mediterranean Command to revise its budget. Some meetings ended with promises, others ended with walkouts, quickly quieted for fear that full strikes would threaten the war effort. And through this tension came the campaign's greatest demand yet. In November 1941, Operation Crusader began, aiming to relieve Tobruk and push Axis forces westward. Alexandria prepared for the surge. Freight lists expanded. Ammunition movement reached levels described in one report as near the limits of human handling. Rail yards overflowed, forcing dockers to store supplies in open ground covered when tarps were available, exposed when not. Officers watched daily tonnage figures, looking for drops that might show fatigue or equipment failure. Everything needed to move faster, and nothing could fail. The strain was visible everywhere. In the cranes groaning from constant use, in the dragging steps of men finishing night shifts, in the quiet calculations of transport officers trying to save minutes from loading times. There were days when the port seemed to bend under the weight of its own success, when meeting the army's needs meant pushing workers to the very edge of endurance. By late 1941, even the most experienced foreman admitted privately that the harbour could no longer match the speed the desert demanded. The campaign's appetite had surpassed what manpower alone could provide. And just as workers began wondering how much more they could give, the war delivered a new and more dangerous pressure, one not from paperwork or schedules, but from the physical threat moving steadily across the sands toward the city itself. The desert was no longer only consuming their labor. It was creeping closer, setting the stage for a summer when Alexandria would face not just overwhelming demand, but the risk of losing the harbour altogether. By early 1942, Alexandria had begun to live under the shadow of a question no port city ever wants to face. What happens if the front line reaches the waterfront? The desert war, once measured in distant messages, was moving eastward with alarming speed. Rumours spread as quickly as convoys talk of Rommel's advance, of broken Allied lines, of the possibility that the Mediterranean fleet might leave the city entirely. Dock workers who had spent 2 years hauling, loading, and repairing now faced a new uncertainty. Not whether they could keep up with the war, but whether the war would soon swallow them. In January, emergency plans quietly circulated through naval headquarters. If Axis forces pushed past Mersa Matruh, the fleet might withdraw to Haifa or the Suez Canal zone. That meant one grim instruction for the port. Crews had to prepare explosive charges for cranes, storehouses, and fuel tanks to stop them from falling into enemy hands. Egyptian foremen and Maltese riggers were briefed in hushed tones about which structures would be destroyed and in what order. Many could not imagine carrying out such tasks, yet they memorized the steps anyway. The port they had built with their labor might have to be torn down by the same hands. Air alerts became a daily routine. Workers joked bitterly that sirens planned their break times more reliably than foremen. Shifts broke into bursts, lifting crates, rolling drums, securing loads interrupted by quick runs to shelters when the drone of aircraft thickened overhead. The June-July raids hit hardest. In some accounts, the alerts were so frequent that crews spent almost as much time sheltered behind warehouse walls as they did working on the quays. Each interruption meant unfinished work, each unfinished task meant delayed supplies for the front, and every delay tightened the tension surrounding the city. Fuel shortages made the crisis worse. Tankers were rerouted around waters threatened by submarines, arriving late or not at all. Petrol drums that once filled entire yards now stood in thin rows, guarded closely by military police. Even dock machinery suffered. Cranes and trucks were limited in operating hours, forcing workers to rely on manual hauling for longer than anyone thought reasonable. Some men pulled ropes by hand where engines once helped. Others rolled fuel drums without mechanical aid, their boots carving grooves into the wooden planks. Dockers noticed the irony feeding the desert war required fuel, yet the war itself denied them the means to move it properly. Beyond the harbour, the city strained under growing fear. Families near the waterfront packed belongings, expecting evacuation orders that never fully arrived. Railway stations were crowded with civilians seeking temporary refuge inland. Shopkeepers locked iron shutters before sunset, wary of both air raids and rising anxiety. Newspapers reported the situation carefully. But news of the Axis advance spread anyway. Some residents left the city entirely, believing Alexandria would become the next target once the fighting crossed the line at El Alamein. Physical exhaustion settled over the labor force like a second skin. The heat of early summer, mixed with constant interruptions and the fear of defeat, pushed morale into dangerous territory. Absenteeism rose not as protest, but as a sign that bodies and minds had reached their limit. Those who stayed worked in a trance-like rhythm. Lift, carry, lower, brace. Some found their thoughts drifting mid-task, imagining the desert edge creeping closer with every message on crackling radios. It felt as though the war's momentum pressed on them personally, tightening each day. By June, the situation in the western desert had worsened enough to confirm every anxious rumor. When Axis forces broke through Gazala and the retreat began, Alexandria felt the shock, as if the sand itself had slammed against the city's walls. Dispatch riders rushed between headquarters and the docks. Officers shouted orders over engines. Workers watched the horizon for dust clouds that might signal the approach of forces no one wanted to imagine. The idea that the port might fall was no longer theoretical. It was a possibility people quietly weighed as they tied down cargo or checked manifests. Then came the near breaking point. 11/12, July 1942. Air pressure intensified, and raids overlapped with the most crucial supply movements. Dockers worked through alerts when they could, gambling minutes against danger, because the front holding desperately at El Alamein could not spare a single delay. It was a moment when the port, for all its machinery and manpower, felt frighteningly fragile. Alexandria had supported campaigns stretching across deserts and coasts, yet now seemed one sharp blow away from collapse. And still, the city waited for news. Whether the line would hold, whether the evacuation plans would activate, whether the port they had fought to keep alive would survive the summer at all. By July's end, one truth rested over the harbour. The fate of Alexandria no longer depended only on its workers' endurance. It depended on what happened next at El Alamein, on a battle forming in the desert that would decide not only the campaign, but whether this port would remain the lifeline of the Middle East or become another casualty of a war moving closer to its gates. When the guns opened at El Alamein in late October 1942, the sound did not reach Alexandria's quays. Yet the battle's weight pressed on every crane, every railcar, every pair of hands working along the waterfront. Victory or defeat in the desert would depend not only on strategy or armor, but on whether the port could keep an unbroken rhythm of supply. Dock workers who never saw the battlefield still felt its pulse each hour. For each hour they gained meant one more mile the Eighth Army could advance. By midsummer, The port was operating in constant overdrive. Shifts no longer ended at sunset. Instead, crews rotated through a near-continuous cycle, hauling crates, rolling fuel drums, securing ammunition pallets, clearing holds, beginning again. Lanterns and hooded lamps cast long shadows across the quays, turning the waterfront into a landscape of silhouettes. Cranes moving slowly overhead, laborers shifting in small groups, officers pacing with clipboards under their arms. The activity never faded. Even during air alerts, the port seemed to hold its breath, waiting until workers returned to their tasks. Ammunition ships received the highest priority. Shells could not be delayed, and Allied rules required careful handling. Dockers learned to treat each crate as both essential and potentially dangerous. They checked for loose fittings, watched for sparks from metal tools, and poured seawater on smouldering fragments kept in buckets beside the quayside. British officers offered quick refresher lessons on safe handling, while Egyptian and Maltese foremen translated instructions for crews whose first language might be Arabic, Greek, or Italian. Every mistake risked disaster, yet the work moved with surprising accuracy, a choreography driven by urgency rather than ease. Fuel deliveries were just as important. Drums for trucks, tanks, and generators filled entire quays, stacked in tall rows that dwarfed the men guiding them. Some workers rolled them in pairs, leaning shoulder to steel. Others used simple wooden ramps when cranes were unavailable or reserved for larger loads. POL, petrol, oil, lubricants was the bloodstream of the campaign, and Alexandria was the heart pumping it forward. Records suggest that throughput during this time reached some of the highest levels of the entire North African War, a fact shown in the fatigue etched into workers' faces as much as in the reports filed each night. The rail lines groaned under the pressure. The Cairo-Alexandria line, already the region's most important link, struggled to handle the constant flow of ammunition, food, spare parts, and medical supplies. Trains queued along sidings, waiting for clearance. Dockers turned open spaces into temporary storage yards, stacking crates under tarps or leaving them exposed when materials ran short. Some supplies sat only long enough to collect dust before being hauled onto trucks. Others disappeared almost instantly, carried by drivers racing to meet tight deadlines set by the front. As the male labor force reached its physical limit, new faces appeared behind desks, in storage depots, and aboard hospital ships. Egyptian women long present in clerical work, but rarely recognized, took on wider duties in documentation, packaging, supply sorting, and administrative organization. Their work eased bottlenecks that had slowed the port for months. They processed manifests, prepared medical kits, managed ration accounts, and organized bundles for forward aid stations. On some hospital ships anchored offshore, women worked with nurses from Commonwealth and Mediterranean units, helping wounded soldiers evacuated from the front. These contributions were quiet but essential. They created the thin layer of order above a system threatened daily by overload. Without them, supplies would have drowned in paperwork long before reaching the desert. Then came the turning point. 23 October 1942. As the Second Battle of El Alamein began, the port's speed increased even further. Orders arrived at all hours, demanding immediate shipment of ammunition, medical stores, tank parts, and high-octane fuel. Any delay could stall an advance or leave a brigade exposed. Dockers listened to the short radio updates about progress at the front and felt the pressure sharpen. They were not soldiers, but they carried the weight of soldiers' survival. When victory was declared on 4 November, relief drifted through the harbour like a breeze breaking a long heatwave. Men who had worked without rest for weeks allowed themselves small smiles. Some embraced, others simply sank onto crates and exhaled, yet the work did not disappear. The push westward required new supplies, and the port, though calmer, now had no plans to stop. But something had changed the sense that the desperate race against collapse was finally over. Alexandria had held the line not with guns, but with endurance. Still, the war was not over. With the desert secure, the port would now shift from survival to support, serving Allied operations in Libya and Tunisia. The workers knew their tasks were changing, but not ending, and as they returned to their daily routines, a new question hung over the waterfront. What would happen to the harbour once the tide of war moved further west, leaving Alexandria to face duties shaped not by crisis, but by long-term change? By early 1943, the Mediterranean no longer felt like a blade pressed against Alexandria's throat. The great fear of the previous summer had faded with the victory at El Alamein, and the city's docks, once preparing for possible abandonment, settled into a calmer rhythm. Raids dwindled, the sharp cry of sirens fading into memory rather than a daily interruption. But peace did not return. The port simply shifted from one type of strain to another, trading the urgency of survival for the complex tasks of rebuilding, reorganizing, and regaining control over labor that had carried the war's burden for 3 years. Ships still arrived in steady lines, but the cargo had changed. Troop convoys bringing reinforcements now carried men rotating out of the front. Hospital ships came more often, their decks filled with stretchers, their wards run jointly by British medical staff and Egyptian clerks, trained during the height of wartime need. Supply vessels still unloaded crates of ammunition and fuel. Yet, these were no longer destined for a desperate defensive line. They supported a broader Allied push westward, through Libya and toward Tunisia. The port functioned as a stable hub rather than a pressured lifeline, and the difference showed on the workers' faces. There was fatigue, but the sharp edge of fear had softened. With the worst months behind them, dock workers began pushing for long-delayed changes. Wage unfairness that had been tolerated during the emergency returned as a significant issue. Egyptian crews, whose labor had powered the heaviest tasks, demanded pay closer to that of Maltese and European workers. Petitions moved through the Alexandria Dock Workers Syndicate, citing both the dangers survived during air raids and the rising cost of living in a wartime city. Strikes never fully formed, the war's needs still overshadowed everything, but minor work stoppages, slowdowns, and loud meetings showed a workforce no longer willing to accept the old hierarchy without question. Administrators, aware that the port could not run without local labor, opened negotiations carefully. Discussions about standard pay rates replaced temporary bonuses. Hazard allowances were reconsidered. And, for the first time, union representatives were invited to formal talks about work hours and safety standards. These were modest steps, yet they marked a shift in the balance of power one strengthened, ironically, by the wartime pressures that had once demanded full obedience. Meanwhile, the port's physical scars needed attention. Wrecks left in the harbour from the 1941 and 1942 raids had to be dismantled or removed. Salvage teams, many of them veterans of the emergency years, now worked with slower, more methodical care. Cranes damaged by earlier blasts were repaired or replaced, coal yards reorganized, and new storage sheds rose where improvised barriers had once stood. The harbour's machinery, steam derricks, mobile cranes, floating docks received overdue maintenance after years of unbroken use. Some equipment was beyond saving and was scrapped. Its replacement was funded partly by Allied money, set aside for post-raid repair. Commerce, too, crept back quietly. Cotton bales returned to the quays, their white fibres packed in burlap sacks marked for Mediterranean and Indian Ocean markets. Crates of citrus, once pushed aside by military cargo, returned to refrigerated holds. Merchant captains complained about sharing berth space with troop transports, while military officers insisted on keeping priority. Dockers found themselves balancing two worlds: the familiar flow of pre-war trade and the ongoing demands of a global conflict not yet finished. Some said it felt like living in two timelines at once. As the port regained a more human pace, something else began to form: an organized political awareness shaped by years of strain. Workers who had endured bombardment, long shifts, wage unfairness, and constant risk now held a clearer sense of their collective strength. Meetings once focused on daily complaints expanded into discussions about long-term rights, representation, and protections. Labour organisers spoke openly about reforms needed after the war: better contracts, safer conditions, recognition of skill levels, and fairer pay across ethnic groups. Small protests flared in 1944 and 1945, mostly contained quickly but not ignored. Newspapers commented on rising worker assertiveness. British administrators reported a new confidence among Egyptian crews. These early movements hinted at the broader wave of labour activism that would sweep post-war Egypt, shaped not by theory, but by the lived experience of a port on the edge of collapse. And yet, even as the war neared its end, uncertainty remained. No one knew what Alexandria's docks would become. Once troop movements slowed, once convoys shifted elsewhere, once the military's firm hold loosened, would the harbour return to something like its pre-war form? Would it modernise further? Would the labour force gain from its sacrifices? Or would old hierarchies quickly return once peace settled fully over the Mediterranean? These questions hung over the waterfront as 1945 approached. The port had transformed under pressure, reshaped by danger, carried by its workers, and now standing between war's residue and the promise of a new era. And while the guns had fallen silent in Egypt, the next chapter for Alexandria's dockers would not be written by admirals or generals, but by the labourers themselves, as they stepped into a future where the struggle shifted from survival to recognition. When victory was declared in 1945, Alexandria did not burst into the loud celebration imagined in distant capitals. The port had been working too long, too hard, for relief to arrive as noise. Instead, the waterfront exhaled. Ships still lined the quays, cranes still moved above the water, and workers still shifted cargo in steady rhythms. But beneath the routine lay a quiet understanding that an era had ended. The war had reshaped the harbour, and now the harbour would reshape what came after. Some of the most lasting traces of those years were marked not in memory, but in steel and concrete. Wartime expansions, floating dry docks strengthened to handle damaged destroyers. New cranes installed after earlier ones were lost to raids. Reinforced warehouses built to withstand shrapnel became the framework of post-war modernization. Engineers who had improvised repairs under pressure now used those same skills to redesign storage systems, improve quay surfaces, and streamline rail connections. The port that emerged in 1946 was not the one that had entered the war. It was larger, more complex, more capable, and thanks to its workers, more resilient. Yet the most powerful legacy was human. As the Mediterranean quieted, veterans of the docks began telling their stories of blackout nights lit by distant fires, of shifts interrupted by sirens, of labour gangs united by danger even when divided by wage, language, or nationality. Oral histories, recorded in later decades, speak of teamwork forged in the dim light of lanterns, of learning to judge the direction of approaching aircraft by sound alone, of lifting crates with shaking arms because the front was waiting, because someone's survival depended on that cargo reaching the rails by dawn. These recollections, told simply and without embellishment, reveal a truth often missing from wartime narratives. The weight of victory rested as much on their shoulders as on the soldiers who advanced across the desert. But the war also sharpened political awareness. Alexandria's dockworkers had spent 6 years under a system that demanded their endurance, while offering limited recognition in return. As British military control slowly faded, debates about sovereignty and labour rights intensified across Egypt. The port, with its layered mix of Egyptian, Maltese, Greek, Sudanese, and British workers, became a key point for questions about who truly controlled the country's economic lifelines. Newspapers discussed the wartime unfairness exposed by the crisis years. Union leaders argued that Egypt's contribution to Allied victory made a strong case for national authority over its ports, industries, and labour laws. This shift did not create immediate change, but it planted seeds. In 1946, waves of strikes and demonstrations spread through Egyptian cities, including Alexandria. Port workers joined with a confidence shaped by the war. They had kept the harbour alive through the worst bombing and the fear of 1942. They understood their value. While British presence in Egypt continued for years, the wartime experience had weakened the old sense of unquestioned authority. A generation of workers emerged with clearer expectations of fairness, safety, and representation expectations that would shape larger national movements in the decades ahead. Economically, the city entered a new period of energy. The skills strengthened during the war turned into efficiency in peacetime trade. Cotton exports grew again, citrus shipments increased. Merchant fleets once more crowded the harbour without competing with troop convoys. Foreign shipping firms noticed the port's improved turnaround times, a legacy of wartime improvisation that had hardened into expertise. Alexandria became not only Egypt's main gateway, but a regional hub whose wartime upgrades allowed it to handle larger vessels, faster timetables, and more diverse cargo. Still, the memory of those years lingered visible in the patched walls of old warehouses, in the stories shared during quiet moments between shifts, in the knowledge that history had once swept through the city and found ordinary people holding the line. Dock workers who had survived the hardest seasons often returned to certain spots along the quays. A repaired crane that had once collapsed during a raid, a warehouse roof still marked faintly by shrapnel, the edge of the coal quay, where a burning freighter in 1941 had nearly taken half the harbour with it. These places became informal memorials, not marked by plaques, but by the people who remembered what happened there. The war had asked much of Alexandria's dockers too much, some later said, yet their labour had shaped the fate of battles fought far beyond their sight. They kept ships moving when the desert campaigns seemed on the verge of collapse. They repaired hulls that returned to fight again. They fed armies not with speeches, but with the steady lift of ropes, the grinding pull of winches, the stubborn will to keep going. And as the port moved fully into the post-war world, one truth remained. History often records the movements of fleets and armies, but rarely the hands that made those movements possible. Along the quays of Alexandria, those hands left their imprint quiet, uncelebrated, essential. It is in that imprint that the city's wartime story ends, and where a different story of memory, of labour, of a nation stepping toward its future, quietly begins. Discover more untold stories of the people and places that shaped World War II by exploring our other documentaries. Stay with the channel for new insights into the hidden machinery behind history, like subscribe and share to support the work. Tell us which overlooked front or forgotten community you'd like to see next, and we'll bring their story to life.